And this is a clip from his sermon. This is part of an intro for Tyler. So go ahead and just watch this.
This morning's second reading comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, verses 14 through 19. The Tyler Coles translation. In the beginning, when God herself created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and shadow covered the face of the deep. While a wind from God themselves swept over the face of the waters, then God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. So very good. And God separated the light from the shadow. And God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night. And let them be signs for seasons and for days and years. And let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and to separate the light from the shadow. And God saw that it was good. So very good. And there was evening, and there was morning. Thus ends our reading.
That is Tyler Coles, Reverend Tyler Coles. I know him from Mount Vernon Unitarian Church. The blog post he wrote for this show, "Therapy is a journey." These are just, and this is a quote from his therapist, "These are just some of the common symptoms people living with anxiety experience, Tyler. And based on what you're saying, you have probably been living with it your entire life." Tyler will share a little bit about his therapy journey. We'll bring him on and we'll take the conversation from there. Tyler, welcome to the show, my friend. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a blessing to be here.
Absolutely. I want to share with folks how meaningful it was when I spoke to you after church that day in February. We had just launched this show, Shining Light on Shadows. And, to hear you say those words in your opening, your interpretation of Genesis, my mind was just all over the place. Oh my God, it couldn't be better. And then it was better because I talked to you after the show, after service, and I said, Tyler, I just started this live stream about mental health. You couldn't have been more supportive. You couldn't have been more encouraging. And right away you said, "Well, yeah, I've dealt with anxiety and depression. I get it." I said, "Wow, thank you for sharing that. Would you consider being a guest on?" Absolutely. Like, you didn't hesitate a moment. I'm just thrilled. Ever since that day when I knew you'd be joining us, I've been looking forward to this day, to share you with the rest of my world, because I have so much respect for you, so much love for you. Thank you for being here. You talked about how therapy is a journey. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience? When did you first realize that you know, maybe should see a therapist, maybe should explore some of these issues? How did that really happen for you?
Yeah, again, thank you so much. It is a gift and a
Sure.
blessing to be here. And I want to thank you for your bravery and your courage, not only starting this project, you and Don, but also just like being authentic and whole and presenting it and having these conversations. It takes spirit to do that. And so I am so deeply thankful for you.
Thank you.
My journey with therapy first actively began in college. When I was in undergrad, I'm the first generation individual in my family to go to college, only child to a single parent, and went to a small private Lutheran school in Southwest Virginia. And it was a period in my life where I was struggling in my relationships with certain family members while being away at college. I was going to college in town, and I knew that things were coming to a head. Like I could physically, tangibly feel things moving within me. And I said, something about this just doesn't make sense. It doesn't feel good. It's making being in school, paying attention, moving about feel near impossible. And so my then boss at the time said, well, there's therapists here on campus that you can go to. And I said, well, you know what? I have nothing to lose at this point. If they can help, I should go. And so I went. And it was over a span of, say, 3 months where I was able to share and first experience therapy as a beautiful tool for wholeness that allowed me to be able to break apart the pieces that I was wrestling with into small, tangible pieces, and then find a way to put them back together again, or at least to put them together again in a new way where I didn't feel beholden to the stress, to the anxiety, to the depression, to the paranoia that came with some of the things that I was feeling. And that was just in undergrad. I have since been in therapy several times on and off since then, and I find it to be a useful tool for me, particularly talk therapy. I'm an extrovert. So being able to talk with a trusted mental health care provider has been really great as I approach it as almost a kind of tune-up, if you will, from time to time to help me stay along in the process.
Absolutely. I started going to a therapist for the first time in college as well, but that was about 30 years ago. So it's been a while. Can you talk a little bit? You wrote about this, so I would never ask you to talk about something that was out of turn. But can you talk about your family and kind of how mental health has played out in your family, and who has been able to talk about it, who's kind of how has it not been talked about, et cetera? Because I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah. I think I'm speaking only from my own experience and probably finding similarities with other folk who are from Southwest Virginia, from the South, from Appalachia, to be even more particular. I was raised with this understanding that mental health is this thing that we shouldn't really talk about, right? We all struggle with it. We all have, things that come upon us, if you will, the great quote, things that have come upon us. You need to go lay down, rest at most, and then kind of just, pull your stuff together, pick yourself up by your bootstraps and just go on with it, right? And for the longest time, there was a period in time where I even thought this was correct. After all, this was the cultural context which I was raised in, right? And it wasn't until that moment in time when I was in undergrad where I said, let me try something different, right? And it was an invitation from someone who I trusted, who was also in a similar cultural milieu or cultural context as me that I could trust, when she gave me this recommendation to try out therapy, right? But again, therapy often is just framed as this thing that weak people do or that certain people do, right? It was never something that either sides of my family, my mother's family or my father's family, spoke about. And that has only recently changed, particularly on my mother's side, here within the last, I would say, 5 to 7 years, by and large, by some of the work that I have been doing with my family and talking about mental health and therapy and getting care for anxiety and depression. And that has resulted in elder family members saying, oh yeah, we all kind of have like those anxiety issues. And not in a dismissive way, but in a way of saying like, we have all had these very same things happen from generation to generation to generation. And Tyler, you're the first one to actually do something about it in a helpful, caring, affirming way. And since then, I've had other family members actually seek out help too.
So you've actually done what we're trying to do with this show: normalize the conversation, reduce the stigma around mental health, get people talking about it, just within your own family,
Yep.
and you've seen results. I mean, that is kudos to you in terms of in some ways that is almost a harder nut to crack. I mean, it's one thing to talk to not strangers, but friends, people, acquaintances, putting this out in the world, um, but to actually talk to relatives and family members, people that know you so well. Um, I think that's incredible. I've had some really great conversations with family members. I'll have to say, when I started this show, and in the spring, in February, I started with a blog post, that I suffer from anxiety and occasional depression, and the outpouring of support that I got, and particularly when family members have watched the show and commented and texted me, that just fills me with so much warmth and so much joy. Just it's so validating. Um, I'll tell you, I feel the same way when like old friends from high school jump on the show and leave a comment. People that I'm not necessarily close to, I haven't talked to in 20 years. We're Facebook friends,
Mhm.
but when people like that jump on, it means something different. I want to recognize some of the folks that are watching, and I'm going to start with Instagram. We can't actually put Instagram comments on the screen, unfortunately, so I'm going to look right and left on my two other computers so I can read out some of the comments on your Instagram account, Faith and Liberation. Uh, um, roll roll Day Columbia. I'm not sure how is that. Do you know who that is, or do you
I
know?
do. I do.
Give them a shout out if they're watching. And then Lady of the Broomstick is
Yeah.
also watching on Instagram. Samantha Collier, who was last week's guest, friend of Dawn's from Wisconsin, is watching on Dawn's Instagram. She said earlier, God is so amazing. Thank you. And that was certainly earlier in the program. So thank you, Samantha, and thank you for a wonderful show last week. I turned this way now because I have another laptop. I hate not looking at the camera. I just have to tell you, and I'm looking off camera. It's even worse. I but I want to be able to read it because Candace started off on Instagram and said she's watching live on Instagram. Hi, my favorite people. So
Mhm.
Candace Sanchez, who also shifted over to LinkedIn. Um, she wrote several comments. She said earlier, "I am in therapy. No shame in saying it out loud." Candace, thank you so much. And she's watching from Wisconsin. She also said that this is a powerful thank you, Neil, Don, and Tyler, for this episode. And she used a phrase that she uses all the time. I don't know if you've heard it or use it, divine design. And it's great because she and I would not have met if it hadn't been for divine design. I
Mhm.
spoke on a panel that was organized by the Milwaukee Coalition, Sexual Assault Coalition Commission, rather, City Commission, and I was sharing my experience as a male survivor. Candace knew about it, but wasn't planning on watching because she had a work meeting
Yeah.
that she couldn't get out of. And at the last minute, that meeting got canceled. And she said, "Oh, I might as well jump on this show and see what's going on." Right? We had never met before. She heard my comments, and at the end of the show, I actually issued a call to for women to help men tell their stories. And
Mhm.
she messaged me right away and said, "Neil, why don't you be a guest on my show next year?" And I said, "Candace, why don't I help you produce it and co-host it?" So that's definitely divine design.
Yep.
Uh, my good friend Renee Jungling is watching. Renee is another congregant at Mount Vernon Unitarian Church.
Mm.
She would have seen your February sermon. I think I'm not quite sure if she was there, but she actually joined after you left. You were an intern minister for us, but she's heard me talk about you a number of times. Renee, I'm so glad you were able to join, even just for a little bit. Stick around if you can. Um, and then we have a great comment from Apollo. I'm going to read this full comment. The idea that you walk off mental health is a figment of imaginations. But that's what I dealt with, and have come out ahead because I refused to accept one opinion, no matter the therapist's past notions. I stuck with it, but not everyone remains encouraged.
That's right.
Apollo, so glad that you stuck with it. Therapy is not easy. In terms of the initial breaking that barrier to get to find a therapist, and then you have to find one that actually works for you, that is a good match. It doesn't always work out the first time. Did you see more than one therapist before settling with one for long term? What's your therapy journey been like in terms of over time? Multiple therapists? You've moved around. What has that been like for you?
I think I fortunate, maybe blessed, maybe depending on who you talk to, just lucky, maybe, depending on who else you might talk to. But I have had the experience that in the course of my moving around from state to state, from job to job, and things like
Yeah.
that, wherever I've traveled, I've been able to find a therapist who has worked for me, right? And I know that is both a combination of blessing and luck, because I know that is not true for everyone. And one of the things I understand, and this might be the result of being someone who is also in a helping profession, is to understand that I and my therapist are coming from very different contexts, right? And so I might take on that extra added work of doing some more translating or more over explaining than, say, another person undergoing therapy would do. And that's just me, right? And I also think it is also a result not only being from a helping profession, but I'm also, like I shared, an external processor.
Hmm.
So I often find that when I'm talking to my therapist and we're using talk therapy, um, I'm actually like reworking pieces, reworking stories, taking them apart and seeking to understand them again as I'm sharing them out loud, right? So I have been lucky. Um, but I know that's not the case for everyone, but
Yes.
it is absolute work. And I remind myself, even the session that I had earlier this week, I had to be brave and I had to be courageous. And there were moments and times where I'm like, don't say the whole truth, because she might perceive me some type of way, or she might think less of me, or some other thing like that. And I had to remind myself, she's actually indeed rooting for my well-being, right? I should be rooting for my well-being just as much too. So if I can't be messy, if I can't show the full silliness that I sometimes have, the bad decisions, the good decisions, all of those things in a therapy session, where else might we do that, right?
Sure.
So it does
Sure.
take courage and it does take bravery, not only to get into therapy, but to stay in therapy.
I have a comment from my mom that I'm going to bring on. To seek therapy for mental health issues depends on different cultures. Different cultures obviously have different uh, notions. Conservative Indians find it below their dignity to help seek and conceal reveal the symptoms. It is still a stigma, and that is certainly a big issue. And that's not something, it's not lost on me, but it's also wasn't top of mind when I started the show and the conversation to be a South Asian male talking about mental health. Um, it's a big deal for a person of color. It you know it there are bigger barriers around seeking and getting help, I think, for communities of color. So thank you, Mom, for sharing that. I want to bring in Jonathan. Jonathan's comment. I've made several attempts at therapy, and none have really worked for me. At this point, I've stopped looking. Jonathan, I'm sorry that you've reached that point. I know that several times in my therapy journey, I've seen therapists that didn't work out. I know one in particular when I was in Seattle when my wife was at University of Washington. We had coverage through the university system. I got matched with a therapist who actually happened to be of South Asian background. I think he was a little older than me. He was more of an immigrant than I was. I was born in the States. Um, and that wasn't a good match. I didn't find a good relationship with him. I actually connected much better with a colleague of his, an older African American male, who I've become really good friends with, and I'm still hoping that he'll be a guest on our show at some point, Dr. Michael Kane. Um, but when I've moved from place to place, I started seeing someone at Wesleyan when I was in college, and this is really the blog post that I wrote. I see a therapist. It almost feels normal for me to say that now. There's so much that goes into finding the right therapist. Sometimes you need to see multiple people to get the right fit. We should do whatever we can to make that process easier. Um, when I started seeing someone in college when I was at Wesleyan University, I moved down to DC, and for me the gaps have been when I've moved, and it's been a while before I've kind of gotten myself organized to go find another therapist. But I saw someone for several years before we moved to Seattle. Then I didn't see someone for a couple of years, and lived in Egypt for 2 years. And then when we came back, I had a major depressive episode and had to reach out for help, and found Dr. Kane through the university system. But then when I moved to DC, I went another 3-4 years before seeing someone here. Just again the inertia and kind of getting organized, but things got to a point where I reached out, and we'll talk more next week on different modalities.
Right.
But and I'm going to ask you kind of your thoughts on this. But next week's show, because again we usually do second and fourth Thursdays, but because we have Tyler kind of in this in between, we're going back to back to back. Next week, Grace Hipona is going to be joining us. She's a therapist based here in Northern Virginia, where I live. She's actually the mom of one of Emily's close friends. And we're going to be talking about in person versus online therapy. And my therapy journey has brought me to BetterHelp. And I've been seeing a therapist for the last 5 years from this very room, from this space every week. So that has worked out for me. What has your experience been with online therapy, Tyler?
I Up until this point, all of my therapy work has been in person, right? And in the before times, before the pandemic, right? In that world that no longer exists, I thought the in person was the ultimate in person religious community, in person friendships, in person therapy. In person was the way to go. And yet, in this most recent iteration of not only seeking out, but being in therapy, I have found that uh, virtual therapy sessions are super helpful because even though I have found in my own personal experience that not only does therapy work, it is wildly helpful. There was still hesitation within me to not only go and find a therapist and find a center, but to like sign up for one and put it on my schedule because we all live, essentially we are all over functioning and we
Sure.
just have normalized it, right? But virtual therapy has allowed me to be regular with my therapy right now when I so much need it, right? Because essentially, the universe said, Tyler, you have no excuses not to go to therapy because you are already on this computer for work. You just need to toggle over to your email and click on that Zoom link, right? And so again, it is a process that is super helpful for me. But I realize that might not be true for everyone because some people might need that in-person contact and experience. And that is totally and completely valid, right? I think so. We have to remember that therapy is not what we see on TV. So much of life is not what we actually see on TV, right? But therapy is a different process where we have to find all the kind of elements, particularly that we need, whether that is particular identities, a therapist might bring particular modalities, a particular setting, whether in person or virtual, different times of days. All of those elements really make it possible for someone to actually work through the therapeutic healing process, right?
It's interesting you should bring up TV though, because in recent conversations, it's actually come up, in terms of how therapy is portrayed in television. Two relatively recent examples in terms of their time frame that I thought were really interesting. Of course, The Sopranos, where you have a mob boss going to therapy. I mean, that's part of the shtick in the show. But there's also another show that I rewatched recently called Suits, which is
Mhm.
if you know Suits, it was on USA, a legal, not quite drama, kind of tongue-in-cheek comedy, tongue-in-cheek drama, I guess I'd call it. But the main character, there's one character who is a hot mess, who is obviously in therapy, and early on they show him with his therapist. But then the main character, who is this big macho, really cool, kind of nothing phases him type of guy, they start having him have panic attacks in the bathroom, and then they see him shown with his therapist. Now, granted, he ends up having a relationship with his therapist a year later, so
Yeah.
that's not really, that's where it crossed that line. Um, but that does speak to the idea of bringing therapy into the mainstream and having it be, you know, um, part of the culture. One other example that comes to mind, I don't know if you ever watched Mad Men years ago,
Mhm.
but the wife was in therapy, and the scene that still sticks in my craw, I still remember it, is a phone conversation between the therapist. They end up getting divorced, but the therapist and her husband strategizing about her therapy,
Yep.
where he goes, well, maybe you can bring up, blah, blah, blah to her and tell her that she should do X. Yeah, that's not a bad idea. I think I'll bring that up in our next set. Like, it's like, oh my
Yeah.
God, like, can you
Yep.
believe that? But
Mhm.
I mean, I have to wonder if that actually, was happening back in the 60s. I mean, that's not outside the realm of possibility.
I mean, let's be honest, it's not outside of the realm of possibility. And I just, thinking back to our comments about stigma and different cultural expressions, I mean, still to this day, right? Uh, I hear therapy or getting treated for mental health care, that's a white person thing, or that's a rich person thing because only rich people have access. And I mean, in a capitalistic world, that's unfortunately true, and that's part of the problem, right? Or only women or weak men get therapy and things like this. And the truth is, everyone needs support generally, but everyone absolutely needs therapy in this moment. We have lived through a cosmic calamity through the pandemic, and there have been tangential disasters and genocides and so many other things. And we have to recreate our world right now, where therapy is no longer seen as a band-aid, but a kind of way of being that is just standard
Yeah.
for all of us, right?
Yeah.
Where we can actually take care of one another and encourage one another.
I want to bring in another comment from your Instagram account. Looking over to my left, Lady of the Broomstick had to leave early, but she says, "But I'll finish watching later. I've been in therapy for 2.5 years, and I'm a big supporter. Thank you for bringing this to light.
Mm.
Thank you for bringing this to light." And as she mentioned, if folks did join halfway through, as soon as the show is over, you'll be able to watch the show from the beginning on Facebook, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on YouTube, on my website. It'll take a little bit longer for us to get the video up on Instagram, but it'll be there as well. So definitely encourage you to watch the beginning, or come back and watch the full show if you have to leave. I do want to make a quick thank you, because the firm that I work with, Digimentors, supports this show on a pro bono basis. They give me the time and the space and the resources, and a number of colleagues watch every show. They help support it by amplifying it and sharing it on social media. So I want to give a big thank you to Digimentors. I'm the vice president of marketing and communications. We do digital marketing, events, and programs like this, strategic communications, training, and workshops. We also help with staffing and recruiting. We also are doing a lot of work around AI right now,
Mm.
helping with policy, strategy, and scenario planning. So again, a big shout out and a big thank you to all my colleagues at Digimentors. It means so much to have their support, time week in, week out with these shows. Um, Jonathan has a quick comment. I would argue that therapists in contemporary drama, as we were just talking about, are too often an update of the maid or valet, a confidant who is actually a surrogate to let the audience know what the character is thinking. Interesting point, Jonathan. Interesting point. It'd be interesting to kind of look through. We mentioned 3 examples, but I'd be curious to see. I'm sure there are other examples where they've written therapists into the plot line when it's not the focus of the show, of course. I'd be curious to see how that plays out. Um, One of the things I wanted to share with folks, if you joined us a few weeks ago, Sarah Wilson was our guest. Now, Sarah is a former colleague of mine from United Way of Snohomish County when I worked in Washington State. She went on to be a therapist, and we had a great show talking about therapy in teen girls. This last week, Pam and I dropped off Emily at sleepaway camp. If you're friends with me, you may have seen a social media post about it. It's a 2-week nature camp. She's going to love it. She's going to come back and school us on everything we're doing wrong with the environment. And we're kind of ready for that. But the important thing is that when we dropped her off and we went to say goodbye, well, not even when we went to say goodbye, it was right after we dropped her off. She's like, okay, you can go now. I don't need help making my bed. I don't need help unpacking. See ya, And I was reminded of this clip that Sarah shared before the drop off. It really came to mind. So I want to play that for folks right now.
I wanted to say, though, speaking of parenting, Neil, you mentioned this in your blog about, I hope Emily still talks to me when she's a teenager.
Yeah.
I want any parents listening to know this. This is very important. They might talk to you less. You might not be their trusted favorite person anymore.
Yep.
They might close themselves off. You're going to say, how was school? And they'll say, fine.
Yep.
I want you to know that's normal. That's actually a healthy developmental milestone that they have to navigate. And not just the teens, but as a parent, you have to navigate this milestone too. I see a lot of parents really get upset and really sad because it is sad. Your little baby doesn't want to talk to you as much anymore and try to double down and be more controlling. And what are you doing? Who are you talking to? That can backfire. And so, Of course, make sure they're safe.
Sure.
But if that happens, I want you to almost celebrate it with a gleam in your eye, tongue in cheek, celebrate it and say, oh, good, my kid is exactly where they're supposed to be developmentally. They think I'm cringy. Good job.
She already thinks I'm cringy, but
well, you're a little cringy. It's fine.
I was going to say, we're all a little cringy, but Neil, you're a little cringy.
Ouch. That clip was great until she started calling me cringy, but I don't know about that, Tyler. I don't know. But that definitely, really was helpful to hear, and it's something we kind of kept listening to. So I'm learning as much from our guests as I hope our audience is. I mean, that's the great part, right? We're growing. Dawn and I are learning a lot from these conversations, and it's been a great process. I want to bring in another Digimentor's colleague of mine, Paula Kiger, watching from Tallahassee, Florida. Paula, thank you so much. She's always been so supportive of the work that I've done, and she helped produce the New York Times Read Along, this Sunday show that I co-host, I guest host, executive produce for Sri Srinivasan. But she was always there right by my side. And Paula, thank you so much. She actually definitely had to experience a number of Saturday afternoon stressed out calls as I was preparing for the show and kind of working through how much I was doing, how much I wasn't doing, and when I was doing it. Paula, thank you for all of the listening that you did. I really do appreciate it. Getting to a point that you were talking about, Tyler, in terms of how what the stigma around therapy is and people's attitudes. I wanted to share this article that I found in Forbes, at least the headline. It's from a study, but 47% of Americans believe seeking therapy is a sign of weakness. What does that bring up for you? What do you think of when you hear that?
Yeah, I mean, the first place my heart goes to, and it's not my mind, but it's my heart, is a deep sense of sorrow and sadness for all of us. in the United States, right? Of how not only are we living with things that we don't necessarily have to live with, right? We're living with things that we don't necessarily need to live in isolation with, but we're also living in a culture that says to seek out support is a sign of weakness, right? Like we live in a culture, a societal culture where getting support is a sign of weakness. That's not okay, right? In any way, shape, or form. That's not okay. And so I worry about our well-being individually and collectively. I worry about our well-being as a nation when almost half of us think receiving support is a sign of weakness or a struggle or an indication that we are somehow less, right? Receiving support is indeed the opposite, actually, in our culture, right? And while our culture might hold to this idea that it is a weakness, I think it's an actual strength, right?
Absolutely.
We learn in our healing process, using healing towards wholeness, right? And if I want to be nerdy with it, because I love talking about biblical language, salvation and wholeness are actually the same word in the Bible. We just done weird theological things to it. I think healing is about being whole, and therapy and other modes in which we seek healing are so necessary to our wholeness in this world. We have become so used to being fragmented, and we have to remember ourselves back into wholeness once more, right? Which is why I'm always often talking to other Southern folk, Appalachian folk, religious folk in particular, saying that religion is a tool towards our wholeness alongside therapy, right? And, moving our bodies in ways that are useful and beneficial, and getting outside in ways that are useful and beneficial, that our wholeness is a result of multiple streams coming into ourselves where we can live productive, whole, meaningful lives day in and day out. And when those moments don't happen, because let's be honest, those moments come when the shadow is far greater than the light, we know the places and spaces we can go to get the support we need.
Absolutely. Knowing who you can turn to,
Yep.
whether it's, if you're not in therapy, if you have someone you can speak to as a friend, a colleague, a relative, um, even just to be able to process your day, to process what's going on. Because I know for me, a lot of I mean, it's a combination of things, right? I mean, I have some longstanding, deep-seated issues that I actually didn't realize were connected to my trauma from when I was abused when I was 7 years old. I actually. I mean, it's somewhat ironic in that sense. I went through high school and into up to college, I think it was, thinking, oh wow, like yeah, I was abused when I was a kid, but nothing. It didn't really affect me. I'm lucky. Like I was thinking of other people who were, you know, had much more extreme and visible kind of mental anguish, mental health issues. I didn't realize that some of the issues around imposter syndrome, where you don't feel like you belong, you don't feel like you deserve what you have. Some of the issues around workaholism, OCD, and anxiety in general. Um, all of that can be tied back to initial trauma, and then other than that, for me, a lot of it has been situational, where I get overwhelmed with expectations and work, and I have my own idea of how much I want to do in a day or in a week. My to-do list is always bigger than than anyone can manage, really, and I get frustrated when I can't get it all done,
Yep.
and my reaction is to shut down.
Mhm.
When I kind of hit that wall, I end up getting paralyzed, and that's to me is the when I talk about anxiety and occasional depression. That's when I shut down. That's the occasional depression, and it lasts for like two
Mhm.
days, and then somehow I'm able to punch through and get a little bit of work done and finish the report, and the project comes out great, and they love it, and I'm like, why was I why was I so worked up about it? Why did I let it, like, when I let it sit there and grow in my mind's eye, and I felt like I couldn't do it, and it just overwhelmed me. And then when I kind of popped that balloon and just kind of worked through it, like, how did I let it get the best of me? But that's kind of the two ways that I've seen issues play out. But um, I think that you can, get a lot of support from friends and family on the situational stuff. The deep-seated stuff, you might need actual therapy. You might need someone to who's a trained professional.
Right. That's right. And one of the things I do want to actually grant permission, right? Because certain times I at least have found myself, so maybe I'm actually speaking to myself, but maybe this might be true for someone else. There might be a moment in time where we find ourselves interested in therapy or other forms of therapeutics, because we're in a setting that is really talking about it, right?
Mhm.
Thankfully, has
Mhm.
destigmatized it. But yet there's still something in there where you're just not ready for it yet, right? Especially if there's underlying trauma, right?
Sure.
It's okay not to go into the deep end, right?
Mhm.
It
Mhm.
is totally, totally okay, right? I remember about 10 years ago when the books My Grandmother's Hand and The Body Keeps the Score came out. These are books about bodily trauma and the ways in which other identities shape and impact trauma as our body stores it. And I believe it is My Grandmother's Hands that say at the beginning of the book that says, if at any point in reading the next chapter, you have X, Y, and Z somatic or physical responses, you are not yet ready to read the book. I made
Mm.
it halfway through the first chapter
Wow.
when I noticed I was having 2 of the 4 somatic responses,
Wow.
right? And I said, okay, closed it down, put it down. And then I started having all this anxiety about, oh my gosh, what does it mean that I'm not ready to be able to address this trauma and things like that? And I had to remind myself that healing is indeed a journey, not a marathon, not a sprint, right? And so maybe you're not ready to do that deep dive into the childhood trauma yet, but maybe you're okay just doing the kind of intro therapy, talk therapy. Fabulous. Maybe you're not there yet, but you're comfortable with talking to a confidant, a family member, a friend, hell, maybe even a colleague. That counts,
Sure.
right? That counts. I think one of the things we have to say to ourselves time and time again is that we are worthy of wholeness. We are worthy of being in communication with others, and we are worthy of being in community with others. Right? Yeah.
Or even we are worthy.
And then there's that part. Generally, at the bottom of all of that, right?
We are worthy.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I learned from Dr. Kane. I mentioned the therapist that I saw in Seattle earlier. His focus, his modality was on self-love. Loving me more is his catchphrase. I love you, but I love me more.
Right.
And that's something, just that concept and that idea, the inherent worth and dignity of all people. To bring some UUA from UU work into the show, right? Tyler
Yeah.
is a minister, a Unitarian Universalist minister. That's how I met him, through our Mount Vernon Unitarian Church. The inherent worth and dignity of every human being. It's so easy to believe that for others,
It's the
but can
hardest.
we believe it in ourselves? Can
That's right.
we internalize that? I want to say good evening to Dr. Tachi, who is watching. Thank you so much for joining us. And then speaking of MVUC, Renee Jungling, Dr. Renee Jungling, because I know she has a PhD and it's not on her Facebook name. She shared a comment. I made a habit to talk to my son when he was little as he fell asleep. I sat with him in the dark
Mm.
and we talked. As a teenager, he would get home late from being out with friends and he would come in and wake me up and we would talk in the dark. I think the two are linked. Absolutely, Renee. That is great. Um, my mom. It's always great having my mom watch the show because she can provide some historical perspective. I shared earlier about how when we dropped Emily off at camp, she didn't need us to help her make her bed and was ready for us to leave fairly quickly. My mom said that I did the same thing when I was 5 years old, and when they dropped me off in nursery school, that they had some anxiety, and but I said bye and just went straight in. And I know I did that in first grade at a new school as well. There's a story about my dad dropping me off, and I'm like, "Okay, Dad, I'm good. Bye." Um, so there's something about that. Uh, we've got a special guest who is able to just log in at the end of the show. We have a few more minutes left, but Don, Don Newberg, Don Helmrich Newberg, we missed you. Thank you so much for tuning in and just saying that you missed us. As I mentioned earlier, Don, unfortunately, is my co-host. Unfortunately, had a work conflict and wasn't able to join us this evening. But I'm so glad you were able to at least come in and say hello. Um, Jonathan shares, I suspect separation anxiety is on the parents' part more than the children's. Yeah, in some cases.
It is.
I know for some kids it's an issue, certainly. I did see one kid crying, one girl. But yeah, it's often the parents who have to deal with that. And Dawn says she will most certainly rewatch the show. Thank you, Dawn. Thank you. We love you. I want to bring in one other stat. So, Dawn, I played your role today. I did a little digging. I'm going to pull the stat back up because we talked about it already. But, Dawn, for your benefit, found this study: 47% of Americans believe seeking therapy is a sign of weakness. Obviously, we don't think so. We see it as a sign of strength. And this definitely had led to some conversation. But the next slide was from a study, and this goes back to 2022. The number of U.S. adults who received mental health treatment or counseling in the past year. And what I thought was interesting is that this jumped. This was a study by Preeti Vankar in 2024. It jumps from 41.7 million to 55.8 million in that last year in 2022. And it looks, there's a steady rise over time. It seemed to be somewhat flat during the pandemic. It didn't, change that much. Maybe it was just 2 years into the pandemic. For some people, they were done with it. I know we were still very careful in 2022, but that's a huge increase. Quick math, that's almost 30% if you go from 41 to 55 million. It's a huge increase. So that's something worth noting. Tyler, every show, we share some general stats as well for folks, not just ones that are specifically related to this show. We share this stat from NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. 1 in 5 adults suffer or have suffered from mental illness at some point in time. 1 in 5. And if folks are interested, you can reach the National Alliance on Mental Illness helpline at 1-800-950-6264. That's 1-800-950-6264. They are a great resource for folks. I definitely want to encourage you to check them out. We also show some stats from Mental Health America. 18%, their stat is 18% of adults have a mental health condition. There are always different ways to kind of look at the numbers. And at that time, that was over 43 million Americans. So that might have been the 2021 number, thereabouts. And their number, you can reach them on their website, mhanational.org, mhanational.org. You can also chat to go to 988lifeline.org if you want to chat with them. I mentioned earlier, and I apologize that if I didn't give people enough of a heads up, enough of a trigger warning. We talk about sexual assault on this show as a source of trauma. Both Dawn and I are survivors. So when it's the focus of a show like it was last time with Samantha Collier, we try and take a little bit more time to give people a trigger warning. But we do share this data point every show. that every 68 seconds an American is sexually assaulted. And we always share the RAIN National Sexual Assault Hotline, 800-656-HOPE, 800-656-HOPE. And their website is rainn.org, rainn.org. I mentioned it earlier in the show, but in case you missed it, next week's episode, again, we're going back to back to back because of this rescheduled show. Next week is going to be the second Thursday of the month. Our guest will be Grace Hipona. She is has a doctorate in education. She's going to be talking about in-person versus online therapy. And it'll be fascinating to hear her perspectives as a provider, what it's like for her, effectively on the other side. I have, I mentioned earlier and shared in my blog post that I been seeing a therapist off and on for about 30 years. Over the last 5 years, it's been exclusively online. And so we'll be sharing our experience with that, which will be really interesting. I know Dawn will be sharing her son's experience with online therapy and what's worked and what hasn't worked. Speaking of Dawn again, and especially because she's watching, I want to bring up her blog post. For this episode, she wrote "The Long and Winding Road to Finding a Therapist." Struggling to find the right fit with the right person can be challenging and defeating, but the ability to understand that mental wellness is important and vital to well-being eventually got me to the right destination. I certainly encourage you to read her blog post. It's, it really is almost like a journal of her experience with therapy from the very beginning. And she speaks as someone who has seen different therapists, has struggled to find a good fit, but it definitely was worth it at the end. So I definitely encourage you to read her blog post to learn more. Tyler, any final thoughts as we wrap up this episode?
Yeah, I think one of the things I just want to go back to Renee's comment earlier about how she created an environment with her child where there could be space for conversation. And I so deeply hope that might be true for all of us one day, that we can create a space where we can hold and tend and care for one another, because we are all worthy of love and care and respect. We are all made with inherent worth and dignity, as we say in Unitarian Universalism. And it was a hard push for me personally to get to that place of knowing of my worth and knowing of my belovedness, to seek out mental health care and therapy as the means in which I received that help. But it is worth it. And that for all of the ways in which people in society tell us and try to save us back from getting those things, we are worth our wholeness. We are worthy of being worthy. We are worthy of love, because that is the source from which we come from. So please stay at it in that journey.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tyler. Thank you so much for that. A couple other comments that have come in. Stephen Kaplan shares that seeking therapy is courageous and a true step toward a better understanding of self. I would never discourage anyone from taking this step. And Stephen, we look forward to having you on as a guest on our August 22nd episode of Shining Light on Shadows. So thank you. And we'll certainly explore some of these same themes then. Dawn shared a comment that she did not have a stable childhood and was a crier at drop-off. So she's talking about the drop-off scenario. So whenever my kids were confident, I felt honored. Absolutely, Dawn. You should feel honored. And that's what Sarah Wilson told us a couple of weeks ago, that it's a good developmental step when our kids are strong enough to move on without us. If you have a few extra minutes, Tyler, Jonathan has a very good question for you, and I can offer some thoughts as well. But what would you say are the 3 things one should look for in a therapist, or do to find a therapist? If you remember, Jonathan mentioned earlier, and in folks, if folks joined us late, uh, Jonathan shared that he had made several attempts at therapy and none have really worked for me. At this point, I've stopped looking. So uh, we can certainly offer some thoughts that might help. What would you think?
I will say in this most recent iteration, when I was back out on the journey in the market, if you will, to find a new therapist, right? I knew I needed a therapist who could hold the identities that I carry as a Black queer person. So someone who could work with those identities, was open to my lived experiences, was able to engage in the kind of healing modalities that I'm most familiar with, that I know work best for me, which is talk therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly one that was close, right? And physically close. And then what just so happened, because I'm using ThriveWorks right now, is that the therapist that matched best with me was not here in the location here in Northern Virginia, but it was in a different part of the state, and did virtual sessions. So I was able to move some of those presumed requirements that I needed, and they have all worked. So think about identities. That's okay to say, because sometimes, a Black person speaking to another Black person is an essential part of that healing process, especially if you've heard particular stereotypes about Black folk in therapy, right?
Sure.
Or other identities, right? Thinking, if you've had therapeutic experience before, thinking about what healing modalities work for you. Talk therapy, again, while it works really well for me, it is not what everyone else needs. So there might be other modalities. So you can think about that. And I think this episode that's coming up next week of in-person versus virtual, that's a new thing we can think about, right?
Yeah.
Whereas we didn't have that ability to consider that aspect, 4 years ago. So that's just a few of those.
It definitely, for me, those are a lot of those are important aspects. And when you think of modality, and really, if you dig into understanding the different modalities, cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, where people focus on tasks to get people to kind of address their issues, versus DBT, and I can't remember what the DBT stands for, but that was more introspective. That worked for me better. But the platform is a big thing for me, having the online option with the flexible scheduling. But that also, some of that is the therapist itself. It may not be, the platform may not be flexible, whether you're in person or online. But my therapist is very flexible, so much so that if I have a conflict, because I don't always control my calendar, sometimes I have a client meeting that has to happen at a certain time. She actually will. I've given her a link to my calendar. She can actually go on and pick a time that's available for her, and drop it on my calendar so that I can still meet with her that week. I mean, to me, it's the easiest way to schedule instead of the back and forth. But yeah, we're going to talk next week. Dawn is going to share about her son, who found that online therapy did not work for him because he needed the commitment of actually going somewhere. If he promised that he's going to be somewhere, he would be there. If he was home, it was easier to kind of get out of. For me, it was just, it's been too easy to slip in my therapy sessions in between meetings, in between other Zoom calls. But even if you hold all those things constant, there's still the question of finding the match with the therapist in terms of your personality, in terms of whether you gel with them. It might take 2 or 3 sessions with someone to realize that I'm not really feeling it. I'm not really, I don't feel like it's working. I mean, you certainly need to give it a little time, but sometimes it's almost like dating, frankly. I mean, you gotta have to give it a little time, and it may not work on the first time, may not work the second time. Then you got to start figuring out whether you want to keep investing time or whether you want to start over with someone else. So Jonathan, I don't know if that helped. hopefully, if you watch next week, we can certainly ask Grace Hapona her thoughts. She is a therapist. Tyler's a minister, and in some ways, obviously, when you do pastoral care, one of the most important things a minister does with their time, um, you're playing the role of a therapist in my estimation. Um, but you might get a different perspective from others, and we have other people who will be joining over the next several weeks. I think it's a great question to keep asking, Jonathan, and I could only encourage you to not give up, to keep that door open just slightly, keep that open just a little crack, so that you might find a therapist. Another friend of mine actually mentioned um, that they felt that it was too late in their life
Oh,
to get help.
mm,
That they were several years older than I am, but they just thought that it was too, um, you know, it was too late to start therapy. And I would posit that it's never too late. That if you can find someone that works for you, um, get that support that you need, even if it's not help, but just get someone to have someone to listen to. I mean, my therapist told me just yesterday, we kind of reflected on the different sessions we had. Sometimes she just listens to what I say. I mean, I just had a lot to share these last 2 weeks, things going on in my life, and she just took it all in, and it gave me a way to get it off my chest. Other times, she's very much more directive and encouraging me to think about certain things, or see what patterns are coming up, or to take note of behavior, good and bad, in terms of my habits. um, there are a lot of ways that a therapist can help, and sometimes it's good just to have someone to listen. uh, Jonathan, always happy if you want to talk. We've talked several times about various things. I'm always happy to listen if that would help. And look forward to your continuing to watch our show. Our guest for this show, this special in between first Sunday show, Reverend Tyler Coles, a minister with the in the Unitarian Universalist tradition. I know him through Mount Vernon Unitarian Church. It has been an incredible honor and a privilege, Tyler, to have you join us. I have thought the world of you ever since you were an intern minister at our church. Always made it a point, especially when you came back to give guest sermons. Your presence, your just what you bring to the table, your way of being, uh, is everything I'd want a minister to be. And just thank you for sharing some of that with our audience. Lisa Napier, a colleague from Mount Vernon Unitarian Church, I've worked very closely with over the last several months. Lisa, thank you so much for watching. Um, and I know that Lisa has been a virtual member, not virtual, a real member, but she lives outside of town, so she's been watching online, watching our services, and she's been with MVUC for a number of years, Tyler. So
mhm.
I know that she saw your sermons when you were there. Lisa, thank you so much for all of the support you've given me over the last several months, and um, I'm just so touched you were able to join today. Jonathan says he says thank you for my offer to talk with him, and a good show. Thank you. We've gone longer than we expected. I will say, Tyler, without Dawn here, we're crisp. Like, we finish our shows right at 8 o'clock every time. Like, we're maybe a minute late, and we're like, oh, we went late, we went long. You know, I couldn't help but go like 15 minutes long with you because it was so good. So thank you for your flexibility. Thank you for your time. And I look forward to folks joining us next week for another episode of Shining Light on Shadows. Uh, be well, be blessed, and dear ones, to quote my friend Tyler, dear ones, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.